Congressman, as we just mentioned, there have been plebiscites in the past. How does one that would be carried out under the provisions of 2499 differ from the ones that were taken before?
Well, for the first time ever, Congress would be speaking. Congress would be the one authorizing the government of Puerto Rico to conduct a plebiscite. And that's very important because keep in mind that for a change in the status of Puerto Rico to happen, two things must happen. The people of Puerto Rico must request a change and Congress must grant it. This is a bilateral issue. So Congress must be involved, must be vested, and that's what 2499 is all about.
Has there been any sign in the past 2 years, 5 years, 8 years, that somebody wants to change the status quo? Have the people of Puerto Rico signaled in any way that they want a new relationship with the United States?
Yes. For example, the last plebiscite, the result we ended up having showed that the only status option with plurality was statehood. It got 46.4% of the vote. None of the above, which was like an ambiguous vote, got 50.2%. The other options got minimal support. The last couple of times that in Puerto Rico we had plebiscites, the existing status, Commonwealth, did not get the last two times, more than 50% of the vote.
But it always came in first.
No, the last time it was statehood because
it wasn't one of the choices.
Because it wasn't, well, it was in the ballot, but the people didn't choose it. Instead, they chose none of the above, meaning a bit more than 50%. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the last time we had a plebiscite in Puerto Rico, again, organized under Puerto Rico law, not a federal law, was 12 years ago. Times are changing. Let's see what happens this time around.
Manuel Rivera, do you support the provisions of H.R. 2499?
Absolutely not. H.R. 2499 doesn't comply with international law. Resolution 1514 approved by the Decolonization Committee and the UN. There are options in that bill, for example, like statehood and territorial commonwealth, that has a lot of opposition in Congress. You saw during the approval of the H.R. 24, it was a substantial opposition to that bill. Secondly, you don't go to the colonized people and ask them what they want.
Why not?
Well, throughout the history of the colonizing territories, the colonizer sit down with the colonized people and they negotiate eye to eye at the same level. Here, they come into Puerto Rico asking people what they want. When the Americans got to Puerto Rico, they didn't ask people whether they want the U.S. to invade. They didn't ask people for U.S. citizenship. They imposed this U.S. citizenship. So this whole process is a process that just going to let Puerto Rico in the same level.
But for my whole life, I've heard criticism of just those two facts, that Puerto Ricans didn't ask to be invaded and there were no Puerto Ricans in the room when they were made citizens in 1917. Here you heard the congressman describe a bilateral relationship where both Puerto Ricans need to speak, and if you follow the logic of H.R. 2499, Congress needs to listen.
Well, Congress has never told Puerto Rico, the U.S. never told Puerto Ricans what they're willing to offer. What are they offering? There is nothing on the table. H.R. 2499, for example, doesn't have the findings that commit the United States to what they did during the history of Puerto Rico, that made Puerto Rico a colony. The options don't have definitions. For example, people of Puerto Rico will decide for Commonwealth. So where are the definitions in the bill? There are no definitions. There's no commitment in this bill to resolve the future political status of Puerto Rico.
Governor Thornburgh, how did you come to your interest in the fate of this island?
I served President George H.W. Bush as Attorney General, and he had a very strong commitment, as has the last 5 of our presidents, to self-determination for Puerto Rico. So in order to serve him and provide him legal advice, I had to immerse myself in the history and background and the legal issues involved in implementing a viable plan to give the people of Puerto Rico the right to choose how they want to be governed. And I think that's been one of the signal principles of this country since its beginning. Self-determination is a very strong thread that runs through our history. So I testified on the Hill for the President and the administration, and over the last 15 or 20 years I've become increasingly interested in this proposition. And as you point out, wrote a book, not a bestseller, but I think a treatise on some of the legal questions and historical setting involved.
You also spent some time at the United Nations, which
did
has
indeed.
used Puerto Rico as a club to bat the United States on the head and shoulders about it being the world's last colony and being sort of held in violation of international compacts.
Well, I got used to being a kind of a punching bag as an American at the United Nations, because there are a lot of interests represented in the UN that are not consistent with ours. So I think you're correct. I think that when the occasion arises that suits the country involved, they will point to Puerto Rico, and with some justification, I think, saying that here you have 4 million U.S. citizens who are not citizens in the full sense of the word, who are not given the opportunity to vote for the president or to have a voting delegate, a representative in the Congress, who have served valiantly in our military over the years, and yet in perverse ways are kind of second-class citizens. And that should be intolerable to the people of the United States. And I know President Bush and all his successors, but most recently President Obama, has made that a centerpiece of his Puerto Rican policy, to give the people of Puerto Rico the right to choose how they should be governed.
So Brian Darling, as the Puerto Rico Democracy Act heads from the House to the Senate, how's it looking?
Well, I think it's going to be a little bit difficult to move because the Senate's got quite a jammed agenda, and this is not something that I think is very high up on the Senate's agenda. I think there are concerns on the part of senators that this vote may be rigged. It's not a straightforward vote, do you want statehood, yes or no. It's a bifurcated, very confusing process. It also would lead to the possibility that a mere plurality of Puerto Ricans in favor of statehood could vote for statehood, and all of a sudden Puerto Rico may decide to elect 2 senators, to elect 6 members of the House, send them to Washington and ask them to be seated. That would be a very unusual situation. And not only that, as a whole, you look at this, we're looking at it through the context of consent of the United States to have Puerto Rico as a state. This vote in the House wasn't overwhelming. There were a lot of concerns that Puerto Ricans that live in the
by 56 votes. It wasn't a squeaker either. It was.
But that's the first step. There'll be the next step that at some point, if Puerto Rico does decide that they want to be a state, then the United States will have to accept that decision. And they may not accept a plurality if it's a mere plurality that votes in favor of it. But I think the biggest concern is the fact that this is a very confusing voting process, the bifurcated process. It's not straightforward, and it doesn't even give the Puerto Rican people a straightforward vote on whether they want to be a state or not.